Okay. Dr. Sharon Hewitt Rawlette, thank you so much for, I'm sorry, I'm going to start over because I messed up your name.
It
I'm
could be
sorry,
a tongue twister.
All right. Dr. Sharon Hewitt Rawlette, thank you so much
Actually,
for
so
being here this
there's
morning.
no L in the Hewitt
Yeah.
part.
There's
No,
not?
there's
So how do you say
Sharon
it?
Hewitt
I'm going to mess it up.
Rawlette.
Sharon Hewitt Rawlette.
Yes.
Okay. All right. That's my second apology to you and apology to you as well. Okay. Dr. Sharon Hewitt Rawlette.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, you got it.
Okay. All right. Dr. Sharon Hewitt Rawlette, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Justin.
Thank you for your patience while I figured out how to say your name correctly. We appreciate that a lot. Um, for the listeners that aren't familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So, my PhD is in philosophy, in the analytic philosophy tradition, for those who are familiar. And I was really only in academia for a couple of years, teaching ethics and theoretical ethics, metaethics. But then I left philosophy just to pursue creative writing, freelance writing. And it was very soon after that that I discovered the field of parapsychology, uh, primarily through the phenomenon of coincidence and synchronicity. But as I began to research what was behind these really odd coincidences that I was experiencing, I discovered a whole wealth of literature about things from ESP and psychokinesis to evidence for survival of death, memories of past lives, all of that. So I became very fascinated about all of this different kind of evidence that's really kind of marginalized by mainstream academia and science. So for the past, I guess it's 13, 14 years at this point, that's been my primary area of study. So I've published a really big book on coincidences called The Source and Significance of Coincidences. I've published a book on the evidence for life after death, much smaller, easier, more easily digestible book called Beyond Death. And that actually it won a prize in the recent Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies essay contest back in 2021. So it's really an essay that's been published as a book. So it's a very it's a concise overview of the wealth of evidence on that topic. And then I've also written a book in metaethics for philosophers, and I've also written a memoir about my own first experiences with coincidence. And now I am actually kind of coming back to philosophy. I've just finished a new philosophical manuscript trying to provide some kind of theoretical framework for understanding anomalous experiences.
Is that what you're working on right now?
Yeah. Well, I've really just finished that manuscript like in the last weeks. So
Well, I've read Beyond Death, and I wanted to ask you kind of, well, I'm gonna be honest. The majority of our questions are about that essay.
yeah, that's the topic
Um,
of your podcast, so that's completely
yeah,
understandable.
yeah, and yeah. So that's where our research team found you, and I did find the evidence pretty compelling. There were some stories in there that I haven't heard before. Um, we've talked Raymond Moody and Bruce Grayson and folks like that, and some of these I was completely unfamiliar with. But let me start by kind of asking you, can you tell us, can you summarize sort of what Beyond Death is about, and tell us what led you to write that?
Yeah. So the major thing that I'm trying to bring to survival of death studies with Beyond Death is this overview look, and not just an overview, but I want to really help readers understand how all of the different types of evidence for survival of death integrate with each other and support each other. Because a lot of times, especially in mainstream media, they will focus on one particular kind of evidence. So they'll focus on near-death experiences, or they might focus on mediumship, if you're lucky. I mean, that's still pretty fringe. But in each of these cases, they'll just focus on that one kind of evidence, and then, they'll try to give, some skeptical explanations, and maybe if you're lucky, they'll give, some of the important evidence for why these things are veridical. But what they never seem to do, and I understand there's space limitations, but they never seem to get around to saying, this isn't the only kind of evidence that we have for life after death. It's not just near-death experiences. In fact, there are also children who have memories of previous lives, children who have memories of being conscious in between a previous life and this life, and maybe even viewing things that were happening on Earth during that time. We have people who experience apparitions of their deceased loved ones, or sometimes they're not even loved ones. Sometimes they're just like random people that they have no connection to, and yet they perceive an apparition of this person and maybe get some information from them that turns out to be true. People have dreams. This is probably the most frequent kind of after-death communication that people get. People have dreams that provide them verifiable information that they couldn't have known otherwise. And there are lots of other evidential characteristics for each of these phenomena that we can get into. But just to list the phenomena, that we've got the apparitions, we've got dreams, we've got mediumship, we've got physical phenomena that they're not as frequent as these others, but they're also evidentially important. We have the phenomenon of phone calls from the dead, phantom phone calls. We have synchronicity and coincidence. And each of these things taken alone does have a lot of evidence pointing toward its veridicality, pointing to the fact that it's actually originating with a deceased person whose consciousness is still continuing. But taken all together, each of these forms of evidence is actually able to respond to some of the strongest skeptical arguments that are brought against the other kinds of evidence. And so when you look at everything together, it's very hard to escape the conclusion that at least some piece of our consciousness is continuing after the death of our body.
Okay. That does sound like a pretty strong motivation. And some of the cases that you mentioned, the one, for example, and I wanted to get into this later, but the phone calls is something I had never heard of, never come across until reading your essay.
Which is so weird, because it's very, very common, and it seems like it's becoming more and more common. And we could talk about it later more, but yeah, it's weird that it's so little known because it happens a lot. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I do want to come back to that. Tell me about, for you, coming into this research at the beginning, did you have any kind of preconceived notions, any bias at all, or was it purely a scientific exploration for you?
Well, I don't think that anybody is purely objective. I mean, we all have, we can say, oh, well, we're, purely objective scientists. But we all have our background. We all have, our hopes. Some people have hopes that there isn't any life after death. They strongly hope that doesn't exist. And some people hope that it does exist. So just to give you an idea of what my background was, I actually grew up an evangelical Christian. So went to church, really strongly believed the things that I was taught. Then I went to a Christian college. And as I started to, it's kind of ironic, but at Christian college, this particular Christian college, Messiah College, was very very rigorous about exposing you to different points of view and getting you to think about your faith. And so the more I, looked into other ways of viewing the world, the more I realized, oh, like the atheists could be right about this. Like, I'm not sure that I have any strong evidence that the view that I was
Sure.
brought up with is correct. So I actually became an atheist while I was at Christian college, and that was a very difficult thing. That's part of what my memoir is about. It was really difficult to break with everything that I'd ever known, and the community that I was most comfortable with. So I say that partly to say, I'm not afraid to follow the evidence where it leads. If I feel like there isn't evidence for what I believe, um, then I'm going to change my beliefs. So, for about 10 years after that, I was an atheist. I mean, there were moments where I thought, oh, well, maybe there's something more, but generally I was just like, no, I just really don't see it. I don't see the evidence. And it wasn't until right after I had left academia, when I went through a really difficult personal time, that I started to experience these things that were mostly, coincidences of some sort, but these things that would happen to me would so closely match the things that I was thinking and feeling that I started to get this feeling that somebody was communicating with me, or that, there was something more going on here than I had realized. And in fact, the very sorts of evidence that I had wanted to find as a college student and didn't find, I felt like now I was seeing. And I was like, oh, I'm going to start investigating this, because maybe there has been this evidence here all along and I just haven't known about it or haven't experienced it yet. So that was back in 2010, 2011. And that was really the turning point for me. So I had left, all religious belief and belief in any kind of afterlife in my early 20s. And then it was about, around the age of 30 that I was like, oh no, I think the evidence actually points back in the other direction. So I do feel like I am somebody who is strongly concerned with what the evidence shows, but of course all of us have our background as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me start in terms of beyond death. The first thing that stood out to me was the communications with deceased spouses.
Mm.
So I wanted to ask, first of all, if you can give an example of that, because you have a few there for the listeners. And then how common is that? Because I've heard of cases like that, but I've never seen a lot of data on it.
There have been several surveys that have been done, mostly in the UK, I think a couple in the United States, and like specifically people who have lost spouses. And it's pretty consistent that about 50% of people who have lost their spouse say that they've had some sort of contact with them from the afterlife. And
50%?
yeah. And granted, I mean, this
Wow.
is those people's own perception of this. This is not like, parapsychologists have gone in and, examined their experiences to say whether they were evidential or not. But those people themselves felt like these were communications from their spouse. So about 50% across the board in these various English-speaking countries. And as you might guess from the fact that there are so many of these, I mean, they're really a wide variety of types of contact that people have with their deceased spouse. Like I said earlier, the most common is dreams. That seems to be the place where most of us are the most open to receiving psychic information that's coming from some place besides the spatiotemporal world that we're familiar with. because our minds are relaxed and we're like our barriers are down, the filters are gone, and these things can come in. So the most common sorts of experiences that people will have will be like a dream where they are seeing this person. Often the person will appear much younger than they were when they died. So that usually appear like, in the prime of life, between 20 and 30 maybe. And they'll often just be sort of exuding happiness and contentment and radiance. And not always, but generally this is the way things are. And it seems like their primary message to the person is, I'm okay, I love you, goodbye. It can often be a farewell message. So a lot of these cases, they're intended to be that emotional connection with the person. They're sending this message of comfort and love, and they don't necessarily they don't necessarily have particularly evidential pieces to them. But the cases that I've tried to collect in Beyond Death and elsewhere are cases where there is that extra evidential aspect to these cases. So one of the cases I'm going to talk about, this was not a dream that came to the spouse themselves. And that's part of what makes it more evidential. Because when you're talking about it, where the person who's bereaved is receiving the communication, there's always this idea, well, is it their wishful thinking? They really want to have this contact, and that's why they had this dream, or even, saw a waking apparition. But in this case, there was a dream that came to what I call a bystander. So somebody who doesn't have an emotional connection to the deceased, that in fact, they're receiving a message that isn't intended for them specifically. And also in this case, it's a case of a dream coming to multiple recipients, to more than one person at a time, which is another evidential layer. So we have this man who had died, leaving behind his wife, and he appeared in a dream to both somebody who he had been like a father figure to. It wasn't clear if he was like a stepfather or maybe an adoptive father. I'm not sure. And then somebody else to whom he was just like a mentor. And in both of the dreams to both of these men, he appeared in front of a house that had these fluorescent colors to it. And he was standing on the lawn beside a sign that said, "At peace with Jesus." And he was in both of the dreams, he was standing specifically on, I think it was the left side of the sign, or the sign was to the left of him. I don't remember. But I remember that they both said specifically that they were arranged the same way. Now, that in itself is very interesting, that two people would have the same details in this dream. But one of them had further details as well, which is they remembered the deceased man telling them in the dream that he had a message for his wife, and that he needed him to tell his wife that he had hidden some money in the wall of their house. And he said specifically, it's like at the end of this hallway, below this light switch, if you go in the drywall there, you will find this money. And so, the man went and told the guy's widow, and somebody opened up the wall at that point, and they found like a few $1,000s that nobody knew that he had stashed there, and that I presume came in handy to his widow. But even more than that, more than the money itself, just the fact of knowing, just the way that verifies that this really was information that no living person had, and yet it was intentionally delivered to someone who then delivered it to his spouse. So there's all these layers of evidentiality there.
It's so wild.
Yeah.
Because I wonder why for a long time, and I have questions for you that aren't on my list just based on that breakdown.
Yeah.
But it seems like I had some similar experiences to you, and I feel like there's a big push in the education system on a materialistic worldview because it kind of works. But it seems that at this point, there's just so much evidence that it doesn't work because the evidence points more to
Yeah.
there being an
Well,
existence of
it
consciousness out.
works for certain things. It works very well when you're dealing with the material world, right? Like our physics works very nicely there. But when you start to deal with things that are psychological, things that are a little bit more complex, um, then we've got all these phenomena happening that that material paradigm can't account for.
Do you think that, in your opinion, and this is a question I know you're probably not prepared for, but Bruce Grayson talked about filter theory, which I found really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's any validity to that based on, because I heard the way you described dreams, for example, and
Yeah.
made me think about that.
Yeah. No, I think that that's a very compelling way of understanding the relationship between uh, different people use different terms, but the sort of larger mind and whatever kind of dimension or space that mind exists in, and these more limited minds that we have in our human bodies. Um, so that filter theory being the idea that the brain is not creating consciousness, but in fact it's filtering out things from the larger mind and just making you focus on what is here physically in front of you at this moment in this point in space. um yeah, I think that that is very compelling. And I was mentioning how dreams are a place where we're more open to that wider mind. And some people sort of have a more general openness to that wider mind as well. Some friends of mine particularly friends who've had near-death experiences, when they've had those experiences, it seems to break down that barrier in a way. And suddenly all of this information that they wouldn't have had before, that they didn't have before, suddenly just starts appearing in their mind. So yeah, I think most of us have this barrier to information that is out there. We like theoretically, we could know all of these things the way that near-death experiencers often say they know in near-death experiences, right? It's about 30% of near-death experiencers say that during that experience, they suddenly know everything about the world, everything that's ever happened, why everything happens, how it all fits together. But then when they come back into their body, that information, for the most part, disappears. And they may still be getting more information than they used to, but they're not, omniscient the way that they felt during the near-death experience. So yeah, I think it's a very helpful model.
Okay. I appreciate you humoring me on,
Yeah,
on that
no,
topic.
I think it's great to have unexpected questions and to just for us to kind of riff on what we're thinking about in the moment.
Yeah, we always have like a nice little script, but I find it we're deviating quite a bit, which is fine. But back to the
Yeah.
script, I want to talk about
Mm-hmm.
apparitions. Um, one, I wanted to know if you could kind of describe that and what happens in those cases
Sure.
for the listeners, and then um, two, is that something because you also talked about group apparitions
Yeah.
or people being able to see the same thing. I felt like we covered a similar case with Jeffrey Olson where there was a shared death experience that his um, spouse was seen by him and his physician.
Oh.
I don't know if you're familiar
No,
with
I
that,
don't
but
know
that
about
was
that
such an
case.
interesting story. Um, so yeah, let's go.
Okay.
I'll let you talk on it first, and then
Yeah. So So apparitions, in general, are cases where somebody sees their deceased loved one. Usually it doesn't last very long. It might be, 15 seconds, 30 seconds. And often there won't be any verbal communication exchanged. It will just kind of be seeing the person, maybe getting an idea of the emotion, like the emotion that they're feeling or that they're conveying through seeing them. And but it isn't always that case. So and this kind of connects to what we were saying about the filter theory. Is there's a wide variety of sort of depth of these apparitional experiences, and I think that that's connected to the ability that the person perceiving them has to perceive all of these things. So you can have these fleeting apparitions, but then you've got cases too of people who actually carry on a conversation with someone else. Sometimes the experience is so indistinguishable from, talking to an actual living human being, that they don't realize that they're talking to somebody who's deceased. There's a case that Melvin Morse has written about in one of his books about a man who he was out fishing, and his brother-in-law came along and sat down with him, and they were talking about some different things, and then his brother-in-law walked off. And when his brother-in-law left, he was like, what, I'm not really sure, how did he get here? He shouldn't be here right now. And then he discovered that his brother-in-law had actually, I think, died in a car accident or something, just, minutes or an hour before he had seen him on that path. So he thought he was talking to the actual guy, they were having a full-blown conversation, and he didn't realize it was a deceased person until after. So there's really a range there, and it does seem like that it helps in perceiving these apparitions not to know that the person has died, because knowing that you're talking to somebody who isn't really in a physical body anymore can be very scary and disorienting, and often can just kind of cause you to snap out of the experience. There needs to be this kind of relaxation and openness to the experience in order for it to continue. Yeah, but apparitions aren't only visual. So even though the word apparition kind of is talking about something appearing, we also kind of lump into that category experiences where people hear a voice. So it's like an external sound, at least that's how it appears to them. Where people smell things. They'll often smell odors that were particularly connected to that deceased person. It might be their, perfume or cologne, or there's a case that parapsychologist Lloyd Auerbach talks about where this is also a case of multiple percipients. He and two other people that he was acquainted with, all simultaneously in different locations, and they were states away from each other, smelled cigar smoke. And they all concluded that this was related to their deceased friend who had been a cigar aficionado. So, and actually, in that particular case, two of them were in airplanes. They were flying in airplanes in two different states, and then one other person was in a different place, and they just all had this experience at the same time. And we're like, okay, well, it must be our friend who's communicating with us. So it can be associated with all of the different senses. Well, I don't know if there are any taste apparitions, but at least smell and hearing and sight and touch. Actually, yeah. Right. So touch is also one. So people will feel something. They might feel a hug. They might just feel a touch on their arm, or sometimes people will see a sort of a physical phenomenon where they're sitting on their bed and it looks like somebody else has sat down on the bed. They can see the indentation form on the bed. There was even a case where somebody had lost their pet cat And the cat used to have this habit of like crawling onto the bed at this particular place. And after the cat died, they could actually see the little indentations of the paws walking across the bed. They couldn't see the cat, but it was like they could see the weight of the cat's feet on the bed. So there's really a variety of manifestations in that area.
I mean, I would bet that one, I know people that have had experiences like that where a loved one passes away and they see them, they feel them
Mm-hmm.
touch their shoulder, things like that. Is that fairly common, would you say, these types of
Apparitions, yeah.
experiences?
Not as common as dreams and not as common as like, synchronistic after death encounters, but I would say it's probably the third most common way. Um,
Is there a lot of criticism regarding apparitions where somebody who's skeptical may say these are hallucinations? Is that something that you hear a
oh
lot?
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, people think, well, yeah, you just, you're sort of having a waking dream. Like your mind is just creating this vision of this person that you loved, which that may be the case for some of them, because our minds are very powerful. I mean, most of our dreams that we have at night, or at least I have dreams that are incredibly realistic. Like it feels like I'm, touching physical objects, that I'm really having conversations with people. And I know when I wake up that that was not true. That was my mind
Sure.
creating that. And so our waking minds are also capable of doing these same sorts of things. So that's not something that you can completely rule out. But what's important to keep in mind with these after death apparitions is that we have these cases where the same thing is perceived by multiple people, where they're having this experience before they know the person has died. So there's no motivation to hallucinate the presence of somebody who you think is, still around. You're just going to see them tomorrow. Like, why would you hallucinate their presence? Uh, Also, no, I slipped out of my head. Oh, new information that comes through these things. So, like we talked about, the the guy having a dream about this money that was hidden in the wall. Like there are various kinds of new information that come through these apparitions. Sometimes, and this can be a little scary for people, these apparitions will convey information about the upcoming death of someone else. So, Diane Archangel, who's an after death communication researcher, she talks about a case that she experienced personally. One of her patients or clients had recently lost his wife, and he was coming to consult with her. And he told her that that morning he'd been washing his car, like he was getting ready to trade it in, and he was preparing it to take it to the dealership, and he had suddenly seen his wife there while he's doing this, and she told him, "Don't bother doing this. Go spend time with your family and friends because you're going to be with me soon." So he told uh, Diane Archangel, I'm a little bit freaked out, but I'm not really sure what to think. And it was that very afternoon that she got a phone call that he had died in a car accident. So, he never knew just how evidential. Well, I mean, he did from the other side. He knew how evidential that communication was, but I mean, that was one that she was able to verify that this communication that he had had. So when you start looking at those kinds of cases, it's very difficult to say that's a hallucination. There's all of this veridical information, and there seems to be motivation behind it. It's not just because there's also the living agent psi hypothesis, right, or the super psi hypothesis. So even people who think or who know that psychic phenomena are real, that people can, know things through ESP, through telepathy, I think, well, maybe you're having a hallucination that you've sort of fed with information that you've gotten through ESP. So maybe this guy, like, he knew that he sort of precognized that he was going to die soon, and to give that information to himself. He hallucinated his deceased wife to tell him this for some reason. I mean, it seems like a little bit of a
It seems more
circuitous,
far-fetched than the
yeah.
original story.
Um, but it is a hypothesis that that some researchers take seriously, even ones that know the literature quite well. For instance, Stephen Browdy, he's another philosopher who has really tried to investigate that hypothesis and show the strength that it has in many cases. But when you look especially at some of these more complex cases of apparitions and other kinds of after-death communication, you see a pattern where it seems like the deceased person has much more motivation to produce that communication experience than the living person has motivation to hallucinate it. Like it's much more compelling as an explanation that that other person's consciousness is going on and they have something that's they feel very important to communicate to the living. And sometimes they will have to, they won't succeed the first time they try to convey this information. And so they'll have to find another strategy for getting the same message to somebody. So especially in those cases where you see these repeated attempts. So an interesting case in this area comes from a friend of mine, Elizabeth Crone. She had a near-death experience in her late 20s when she was struck by lightning. And that kind of opened up a lot of psychic phenomena for her. But this will kind of transition into maybe talking about telephone calls from the dead. So a few years after she had her NDE, she got a phone call in the middle of the night. She picked it up. Her husband was asleep in the bed next to her, but he woke up too. He heard this phone call as well. The person on the other end of the line was her deceased grandfather. And they had a pretty involved conversation. But the reason I'm telling this story right now is because one of the things she said to him on the phone was, he said he specifically had a message for her mother. So his daughter, her mother. And she said, well, why didn't you just call mom then? Like, why did you call me to tell me this to tell mom? And he said, well, I tried calling her, but she can't hear me. And so Elizabeth talked to her mother afterward, and she was like, yeah, I get this feeling like he's trying to communicate. Like, I can feel that he's like there, but I can't figure out what he's saying. So, and there are other examples of this too, but when we see the deceased sort of go from one person to the next person, like trying to find somebody where the filter is porous enough that they can get that information through, it's just like, yeah, this is not hallucination. Like there's something real. There's a real person on the other end. There's somebody there with real feelings and desires and hopes and love, and they're trying to communicate that to the people who are still in the physical world.
You're big on synchronicities, and I think it's fascinating. That's directly what I wanted to go into next, was these phone calls.
Oh yeah.
I think that's going to be difficult, I think, for a lot of listeners to get their head around. Because for me, from just being a bit of a skeptic, the idea of an apparition makes sense to me. People having near-death experiences, it's personalized, right? You can't certainly say it didn't happen because they're the ones that were there. But yeah, I mean, a phone call, it seems at some point in research they could record this if it were.
Well, and there have been recordings made of some of these calls.
There have been. Wow.
Yes. Now, one weird thing that happens is that often, I mean, this is just, I'm spitballing here, but I feel like maybe like in 3/4 of the cases, these recordings erase themselves. Like they're, and sometimes a lot of these cases I'm thinking of are from the days when people actually had like physical answering machines, right? That they would actually have like a tape that would be recording things, and then there would be a recording, and then it would be gone when somebody went back to listen to it later, or they might listen to it 2 or 3 times and then it would be gone. Now, I mean, we can get into theories about why that's happening, but what I think is most interesting about these phone calls from the dead is the way that they're kind of on this border between something physical happening and something mental happening. So I think one of the reasons that this is becoming such a common way for people to be contacted by their deceased loved ones is because well, first of all, it's a very common way that we connect with other living people, right? So we're very used to this idea of, having a phone to our ear and hearing the voice of somebody who's not physically present. Okay. So that can be a situation that helps put us at ease, right? So we talked about how important it is for us to be relaxed, to feel like this is normal, not to be scared. And so if your phone rings and you pick it up and, you hear a voice that doesn't seem to be coming from, anywhere in that physical room, that's a normal experience that we all have. And so it can kind of be a way to ease us into this idea of talking to somebody who is actually deceased. It gives us a frame for that experience, or context for that experience that makes sense. Now, one of the weird things about this is that it's not clear in a lot of the cases that this is an actual phone call that's coming through the phone lines. Okay, and in some cases, it's very clear that it's not. So a lot of cases, you'll have phone calls, even repeated phone calls coming through the same phone, and they'll be coming from an unknown number. Sometimes they're coming from the number of the person who is deceased, even if their phone number is no longer active. But then other times they're coming from an unknown number. The person who receives the call calls the phone company to see, like, where is this phone call coming from? What's going on? And the phone company themselves has no record of the call coming through. So it's as though the deceased is somehow directly interacting with the phone itself, not, using cell towers, not using, landline cables in order to talk to you. There's also there's phenomenon where people, at least in the old days when people had landline phones sitting around, they would get phone calls on a phone that wasn't even plugged in to the wall, right? So it wasn't even getting electricity, and it certainly wasn't getting a signal from the phone cables. And yet the ringer goes off, and then they're hearing a voice. So there seems to be this extent to which there's some extent to which the deceased seems to be physically affecting the object of the phone, but there also seems to be an indication that what's happening is something that's in the mind of the person who's receiving the phone call. So that the voice, for instance, like if we go back to my friend Elizabeth, so she could hear this voice when she picked up the phone. And her mother, I don't think got phone calls, but her mother just had this sense of the presence of her father, but couldn't understand what he was trying to tell her. So her mother was not able to perceive the voice, which seems to indicate that the voice is something that's sort of telepathic, that's a mind-to-mind communication. But at the same time, Elizabeth's husband, who was sleeping in the bed next to her, he heard the phone ring. So the phone seems to have physically rung, and yet the communication afterward was on this more telepathic wavelength, because he couldn't hear the voice on the other end. He probably couldn't have heard a voice even if it was a regular phone call. He just heard Elizabeth's end of the conversation talking to the person. So it is in this really weird borderland between the physical and the non-physical, which is part of why I find it so fascinating, because I'm really interested, as a philosopher, I'm really interested in, like, well, what even is the physical world? What makes something physical or not physical? And how do this idea that there might be things that are happening that are like partly physical and partly not, is, from a metaphysical perspective, just fascinating to me.
I think it's fascinating as well, because that's essentially the case you just described as like a verifiable case.
Yeah.
Because why would her husband be hallucinating
Right.
the phone
Yeah,
ringing?
he has no reason to. Yeah. And it woke both of them up out of sleep, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Do you do a lot of public appearances with this information?
I do a lot of podcast stuff. I mean, I've given some lectures and things, but mostly what I do is, online like this. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Should do more. We can. It's good stuff. Let's talk about NDEs.
Okay.
I have this, and I may as well ask you this. We have covered Pamela Reynolds and that case. In your opinion, just on that case alone, is there anything you feel like you could learn about consciousness from that case?
Well, one of the things that I find most intriguing about that case, I mean, there are lots of intriguing aspects that I'm sure you've gone over in your episode about this, but the fact that when she was under anesthetic, but then she also had, these like earbuds that were sending very loud clicks into her ears, and that was specifically in order to get to be able to monitor how conscious she was. So they were watching her brainwaves, and they wanted to see whether the clicks were showing up in her brainwaves, because that would show, we need to give her more anesthetic. She's not, completely under. So this was part of the anesthetizing procedure. So she has no way to physically hear things that are going on in the operating room, because if she hears anything through her ears, it's going to be these clicks, which aren't showing up. The doctors are saying that her brain is not registering these clicks. But at the time that this is happening, she herself has an experience of hearing things that the medical staff are saying to each other in the room. Are they talking about what artery they're going to be able to use, and they're having to use a different artery? I forget the exact details. And so this shows it's not that somehow she is still conscious through her brain, because they're monitoring her brain's ability to process auditory signals, and she's not getting any of those signals. She is able to clearly hear what people are saying in the room. So how is she getting this information, right? And one of the really continually puzzling aspects of NDEs to me is the way that the consciousness seems to have become detached from the body in this sense, and yet it still seems to be focused on a particular place and time. So it's like they're not in their body anymore, but they're still in that room. They're still taking in information specifically focused on that spot. They're not, just observing everything that's happening everywhere in the entire world. They're still there. So what's the connection? I mean, how does that mechanism work? How's that process work? if the brain generally acts as our like filter or focus mechanism to, filter down consciousness in this way, well, something is still doing that. Something is still allowing that disembodied consciousness to focus on this particular room and what's going on there. So what is it? How does that work? I don't know. I mean, I have some ideas, but they're not clearly formed yet into a theory.
I don't have a theory.
Yeah.
I can pitch at that. It is fascinating because I think it started a lot of these conversations in that particular case.
And I think it's really important to do what you and I just did and said, this is really odd information. Like, it's really odd that this happens. I don't know how it happens. But to be able to say, but it might still be happening. Like, because there are a lot of people who would say, well, if we don't know how it happens, if that's impossible on our current understanding of physics or the nature of reality in general, then just say, well, it can't be happening. There must be some other explanation. And I think it's really important to be able to say, no, look, this has happened in enough cases. I mean, NDEs have happened to somewhere between 4 and 15% of the general population. Like, the general population, not just people who've come close to death, but yeah, 4 to 15% of people have had this kind of experience. And when that many people are experiencing a consciousness that is detached from their body, we need to take seriously that this is something that happens even if we don't know how it works, because that's the only way that we're going to find out. We're going to progress in our understanding of this.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. And I think part of the reason that I was open to doing this particular podcast is that exact thing. When we talked to Dr. Eben Alexander, he felt, at least my perception is, he felt attacked a lot from people on the scientific side that this was, a hallucination, this is not real. But yeah, the number of people that have this experience, and not just in the Western world, but globally,
Yeah.
it warrants more time and research and just open-mindedness to those conversations at the very least.
Yeah.
Um,
but it is very threatening to the current state of, science has such a high status within our society, science and technology, and it's very threatening to the status of those people in those fields to have to say, well, yeah, I mean, this is a real thing that's happening, and we don't have a clue what's going on. So, yeah, I understand why it's hard for people.
I do too. I think it's almost, I discussed this, I think, on the last episode, how, and about the idea of deconstruction, and it seems to me like a similar thing is happening in a materialistic worldview. People have embraced that, right? And then when you present evidence, oh, maybe there's holes in this, it's very difficult for them to even hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very threatening. We like the security of knowing things, if not with certainty, at least with something very close to it. And yeah, it's hard to admit that everything that you have believed for however many years might be wrong, or at least that there might be a deeper truth that you haven't been seeing.
I think that's well put. Let's talk about shared death experiences, because I think some of these, they're so interesting, and there seems to be, as you said, there's a element where someone wants to send a message in a lot of these cases. And to me, they're more fascinating sometimes than even just a person's NDE, where they go through the tunnel, they have a life review, they have all these experiences that are pretty common. But these shared death experiences are often unique, I think. Can you describe a shared near-death experience in your research? And then, if you don't mind, to tell me, in your opinion, if they give us a different type of
Mm-hmm.
information about human consciousness. It
Yeah.
seems that a lot of those cases are more verifiable, right? There's two
Mm-hmm.
people and some are uninvolved.
Yeah. So, one of the cases that I talk about in Beyond Death is a case where there were actually several siblings. I think there were four siblings who were present at the death of, I think, their mother. They were all in the hospital room, where she had just died, and they all saw the sort of lights um, appearing in the room and shaping themselves into a kind of gateway, they said. And they didn't see her spirit sort of go through it, because some people experience that in a shared death experience. They didn't, I don't think, see her spirit, but they all saw this sort of gateway, and at least one of them heard this very sort of ethereal music, this beautiful ethereal music connected to it. And oftentimes, um, a shared death experience will be something. So first of all, let me just say, a shared death experience often will just be one living person who is sharing the experience of a person who is dying. Okay, so they won't have anybody else that they can talk to about the experience, because the other person who presumably shared it has now passed on. But in the case that I'm talking to you about, here you have multiple living people who have experienced it, which lends this extra level of evidentiality to it, because they can all say, I saw this, and other people say, yeah, I saw this too, and they're all describing the same kind of thing. So it seems to point to it being something objective that is happening. Um, Another case was a couple of sisters who, again, I think were at the bedside of their dying mother, and they actually experienced her life review. So they saw events in her life happening just the way NDEs often describe. They said that they saw like events that they never knew about in their mom's life. So like somebody that she had dated when she was a teenager, like her first love, they saw what had happened there. And they saw some recent things in her life that they didn't know about, like the fact that she was, I think, in love with a neighbor of theirs or something, and they didn't know about this. So there were these events that they both experienced, and they were able to talk about afterward and be like, "Wow, like I didn't know this about mom. This is very interesting." So,
And what a way to find out
well,
too, by
yeah,
actually seeing it,
yeah,
opposed to hearing the
right,
story.
yeah, not just hearing about it, but yeah,
Yeah.
seeing your mom when she's 17, on her first date with some guy. Um, so what's so fascinating here, again, we have this like, okay, so in what realm is this happening? Is it like more than one person is experiencing the exact same thing? So it's not like a purely mental space, that people are in, or if it is, it's a shared mental space. Like it has an objectivity to it, even though it's mental. Um, and it's really fascinating that these people are experiencing the same things that NDEs are reporting, right? Whether it's, this like gateway that NDEs would, or a tunnel that NDEs would talk about going through, or it's the life review or other things, but they're not dying, right? So you can't say, well, this is just the hallucination of a dying brain. Like this is why NDEs experience that. These people, their brains are not compromised in any way. They're just sitting around in the hospital, and they can perceive the same things that the NDEs are perceiving. So yeah,
Have you heard an explanation for that? I mean, has anybody ever said, "Hey, no offense, doctor, I think I can explain that." Not me.
um
I'm just asking.
yeah, no, well, I mean, I think the there's sort of a rough and ready explanation that a lot of people who've experienced a lot of these things, particularly people who are intuitively gifted or have mediumistic capabilities, say, well, yeah, it's another dimension. Like, and you see it or you don't see it, but it's still there. And it's sort of intersecting with ours. So there's this other dimension in which, you know, the afterlife is this other dimension, or maybe multiple dimensions, but it's something that is always there. We're sort of always in it. We just aren't aware of it. You know, our filter is filtering out all of that information. But when the body and the brain stop working, they stop filtering that stuff, and suddenly you're like, oh, I'm in this other place. I had no idea that this was all here too at the same time. And so I think, living people, if they're capable of, if their filters are porous enough that they're able to get some of this information, they can see some of what's going on in that dimension too.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about, let's talk about premonitions or the awareness of future events. We covered Dr. Mary Neal.
Mm-hmm.
Haven't had her on yet, but I found her story fascinating. Yeah. Do you have an example of one of these cases from your essay, and also with the future events? Did you find any type of, I mean, in your research, I'm wondering if there was anything that made you more open to that going into these experiences?
Mm-hmm.
I know that's a tough question. I just wanted to ask and see if you had any ideas.
So precognition is a difficult area because the future still seems to be fluid to some extent. And so you're not going to get, even with, predictions about the future that, people may receive during near-death experiences, or, a waking intuition or a dream or something like that, you're not going to get 100% accuracy, just because I don't think that the future is set completely. There might be things that are more probable to happen in the future, but they're not absolutely sure. And we certainly do see with near-death experiencers who, they have visions of the future while they're on the other side. And, back in the 80s, you saw a lot of near-death experiencers who were saying, there's going to be a terrible, nuclear holocaust. There's going to be all of these wars, in the next 10 years or something. And we certainly saw some wars, but we didn't see, the entire Earth disappear in a nuclear holocaust. We didn't see things as catastrophic as what a lot of them were predicting. So it's not, we can't just say, well, anything that somebody perceives in a near-death experience as happening in the future is going to happen, because that hasn't been the case. At the same time, there have been people who have gotten very specific, often much more personal predictions in their near-death experiences that have come true. And I'm going to mention again my friend Elizabeth Crone, who, by the way, I'm not revealing her personal secrets to the world. The thing that I'm telling you are all things that she has talked about publicly herself in her books and in interviews. But she, while she was in her near-death experience, she got, for instance, 2 very specific pieces of information. Well, no, 3. One was who was going to win the upcoming presidential election. So she had her near-death experience in September of 88, I think it was. And then in November of 88, the first Bush was elected, and she had been told in her NDE that that's who was going to win the election. Of course, I mean, it was like a 50-50 chance that this person would win. But she was also told who was going to win the Super Bowl that year. And of course, we were just at the beginning of the NFL season at that point, so I had no idea who the teams were even going to be, who were going to play. So she was told that. Both of those things came true. And she was also told that she was going to have a 3rd child who was going to be a girl. And that did happen a few years later. So she had very specific pieces of information, and she believes that those pieces of information were given to her during that experience to help her understand when she went back to her body, the reality of the experience that she had, and to sort of to remind her of everything that she had been told while she was on the other side, to kind of anchor it in this physical world. And she is she seems to have a particular connection to precognition in general. So she now, it's been 30 some years since her experience, but she has had repeated, exceptionally detailed precognitive dreams about things like airplane crashes. Like, she'll get dreams about the specific number of the flight, the number of people who are on board, things about how it crashes, and then those things are verifiable. And she's sent emails to herself ahead of time with the details of it, and before the plane crash has happened. So I think her case her case is very exceptional. But I think part of the reason that she may have had that extra layer of precognitive information in the NDE is because of the importance that precognition was going to have for her life in general afterward. So I'm mentioning that case because I think her case is extremely strong evidentially. It shows that precognition is absolutely a reality. That doesn't mean that everything that people perceive as happening in the future is going to happen. It just means that there is some accurate information that gets through, that comes from the future, and that is verifiable, and is so precise and detailed that it's very improbable that it could have been a guess or just a coincidence.
What about a case like Dr. Neal's, where she has this near-death experience and is told that her son will pass away, that happens? Are the cases, because you just described the case of your friend, and I'm wondering if there are a tendency to these being more life-altering type of premonitions, or if it's just random, like, because knowing who wins the Super Bowl, helpful if you're gambling.
Yes.
But, and it is hard. I agree. When you said that, I was like, the probability that it's just a guess, who knows who's going to win the Super Bowl from year to year. Yeah. But yeah, I wonder if you find in your research that it sways one direction more than the other.
To being like life-altering information.
But yeah, I guess premonitions that are more related to the person having the experience than, say, a prediction about a world event, let's say.
So I think, I was gonna say that I feel like, particularly for people who are not as psychically tuned in, that it tends to be like very important life-altering events that we precognize. But I don't know that that's true, actually, because I have a lot of friends who they'll just have these weird random precognitive dreams about stuff that seems completely mundane, like it's not important. It'll be just like a detail about something that somebody is going to say the next day, or like something they're going to see on TV, that it's not a world event of any importance, but it's just like it's something that's unusual enough that they can directly connect it to the dream, and they know that it was precognitive. But if they try to say, well, why did I see that ahead of time? Like, what good does that do? There doesn't seem to be any particular reason for it, except that it confirms to them that precognition is real, that they do have a connection to the future. They do have a connection to something that is beyond the here and now. So yeah, I think it's both. Yeah. But that
That's a good
but
answer.
but that realization too, even if you're precognizing something that is totally mundane, the realization that you were able to do that itself can be life altering. So I it does seem like these things happen with some kind of purpose. It's just that the purpose may not always be that specific information. It may be just the effect that it has on you and your view of the world.
Okay. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. We try to keep everybody in a
Oh wow, yeah, it's fun.
decent spot because we've talked for a
Yeah.
bit. What would you want readers, listeners, people who interact with Beyond Death to take away from your work?
Well, there is one really important aspect of Beyond Death that we haven't talked about, and I think it is really important, so I'm going to mention it. I did mention the super psi or living agent psi hypothesis, this idea that after death communications might be a combination of hallucination with our ability to like gather information unconsciously by ESP, and we create these convincing these psychically powered convincing hallucinations of our deceased loved ones. For me, the most important evidence that tells against that hypothesis is the fact that we have apparitions, dreams, even like physical sort of poltergeist-like phenomena. We have all of these phenomena where there are examples of people who, not only the people who have experienced them from like the living side, but we have examples of people who remember being the deceased person that is causing that experience. So, for instance, children who have memories of previous lives sometimes have memories of being conscious during the intermission period between lives. And some of those children report having come to a loved one in a dream. And that person independently remembers having had that dream. You have children who remember having appeared as an apparition to somebody and had an interaction with a living person after they had died, and that person remembers the apparition. There are even a couple of like poltergeist examples where a child remembers having, like in one case, remembers hanging around outside of his former home after he had died and like hanging out in this tree. And he was annoyed at these women who were swinging on this swing that was in the tree. He didn't want them swinging there for whatever reason. And he ended up breaking the seat of it so that they would fall and they wouldn't be able to swing anymore. And the person who was investigating this case went and talked to the person that had been his father in this previous life, so had lived in that house, and asked them, did anything like this happen? He said, yes, there was this case when these two women were swinging and the seat of the swing broke. So there are these events where it can't just be wishful thinking or hallucination, because somebody remembers being on the other side. Somebody remembers having intentionally created that apparition or that dream or breaking that swing or whatever kind of communication they created with the living people. So those, I call those reciprocal cases. So the reciprocal cases are really important because they show the connection between those third person experiences and the first person experience. And some of them too, you talk so much about near-death experiences on this show. A lot of those are cases of near-death experiencers as well, who appear to people when they're in a near-death experience. So I think I've got 2 cases of that in Beyond Death, where somebody who is maybe they're under anesthetic, or they're in the hospital for some medical condition, and they appear to somebody at another location, and then they tell somebody afterward, I went and, I saw so-and-so at this place. And that person verifies, yeah, I saw them. I didn't know why they were there. I thought they were in the hospital, but then there they were at my bedside talking to me. So yeah, reciprocal cases, very important, very evidential.
Okay. What, if anything, are you going to be working on next in terms of your research?
So I have been working on this really theoretical stuff. It's so far, the book that I've just finished is for philosophers, but I am hoping to write something that is for a more general audience. Right now, if people are interested in that research, I have actually done a couple of public talks that are on YouTube about this. If you search for my name, Sharon Hewitt Rawlette, and Rice University, you should find a talk that I gave last year specifically about how we might be able to understand, use psychic phenomena to understand how the mind and the brain and the body interact. So that's really, I'm interested in this intersection between the physical and the mental, and then how the body and the brain get in there. So that's what's occupying me mostly right now. I am also interested, I'm just at the beginning stages of this project, I'm also interested in the concept of destiny and life plans, which a lot of NDEs we kind of touched on this, we're talking about precognition, but a lot of NDEs come back with this conviction that their life has a mission, has a plan, that there are certain things that are supposed to happen. And I'm very interested in looking in more detail about the evidence for that and all of the ways that that manifests in people's lives. So I'm kind of at the beginning stages of collecting information about that. So if any of your listeners have really interesting stories that are connected to evidence for life plans or destiny, they should certainly get in touch with me. My email address, by the way, is on my website. So you can Google me and find my email and send me a note.
Well, let's talk about that too, for people that, because I think there will be people that hear this and would want to know more about you, connect with you, support you. Where can they find you online?
Yeah, so the best place is my website, SharonRowlette.com. But you can also find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter. And again, my email address is on my website.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. It's definitely been a pleasure on our end.
Yes.
And hope we can do it again soon, because there's just, it seems your essay is really just tip of the iceberg,
Yeah.
it seems like, in your knowledge of this this area. So
yeah, thank you so much for having me, Justin. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I felt like it was a lot of back and forth and really diving into the meat of these questions. So thank you.
thank you.